Hey, hello. Thank you for joining this Q&A live stream to celebrate 60,000 followers for the Money and Macro channel. Someone asked me if I work at the University of Groningen, because I live in Groningen, and indeed I do. So I'm a lecturer, part-time lecturer at the moment at the University of Groningen, teaching courses in the Master of Economics and Business, but also Finance, Economics, on international banking and finance, global finance and growth, and international financial markets. But that's what I teach at the University of Groningen, and I still work for the University of Cape Town as well, but that will end in a month. Oh, this is an interesting one. Why do you choose to spend your time making YouTube videos? What are you trying to do? Well, so the thing is, when I finished the PhD, which I really enjoyed, I always just wanted to know how the economy works, and I think a PhD is an amazing opportunity to do that, because you have so much free time to interact with some of the most brilliant people, brilliant economists that are out there, dive into literature and operate, I think, at the highest level of, parts of economics. But then after that, the academic world is really competitive, and it's also pretty close-minded, so it's really focused on doing specific types of research. So for example, doing regressions or econometrics, so I think the cool thing about YouTube is that it really enables you to do research that you would never be able to do in an academic journal. So for example, I did this really long video on comparing the American economic model versus the Dutch economic model. And this is really a case study. But the thing is, in academic economics, you can't do case studies. They just don't get published in the best journals. To me, that's just the most interesting. And I also want to do, so just to answer the question from Samuel, who kindly donated, because it ties into this, which markets do I find especially interesting? So the cool thing about YouTube is that I'll be able to make some videos about these markets and thus learn about these markets, because even if you do a PhD in economics, you only get to focus on this very specialized topic, in my case financial markets and monetary policy. But for example, I just sold my house, the one I'm in, the Money and Macro channel will actually move to Belgium, and everybody who knows the Netherlands and many other European Western countries knows that the housing market is just absolutely insane, right? It's crazy. And so what I will do is I'll make a video on that. And I get to truly do a deep dive into this housing market. But in academia, I would never be able to do that, because I'm not specialized in housing economics, right? So it would take me a year to be able to operate at that level. Whereas now on YouTube, I can just do a research, sort of a more broader research. So housing is something I'm super interested in. Energy, not yet, but I would like to also do a deep dive on that at some point, just because I don't know too much about it yet. Financial markets are really where it's at for me, in the sense that that's my specialization, and that's banking, finance, it's the stuff I know most about. But I also really want to dive into manufacturing, labor markets, basically everything. Okay, Antoine, are there any economists that inspired you to pursue economics? Yes, indeed. Well, it was mainly my supervisor. So this is Professor Dirk Bezemer. He's my supervisor, and he really was the first one. So at some point I did a master's in finance, and I was like, I actually saw this YouTube video, The End of the American Dream is what it's called. It has, I think it's been viewed millions of times. And it says, well, banks create money, and it's all a big conspiracy. And I couldn't refute it as a finance student. And so I asked my finance professors, hey, I saw this video. Do banks really create money? And they were like, well, Yuri, I don't know. Which I thought was extremely strange, since they're a finance professor, so I think you should know that, right? And then, but they pointed me towards Dirk Bezemer, and he was the one that actually knew a lot about this. And so he started giving me these books, and I started working for him. And we actually made this series on YouTube together called Debt, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You can also type that in the chat. And it did, and actually did really well. Not the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I did all the editing, or a lot of the editing on that one, and helped him to film it all. Do you think Dirk Bezemer's debt model is still valid for understanding economies today? If so, what aspects should we be paying attention to? So what he's referring to here is Dirk Bezemer has this theory about debt and money creation, where he's saying this used to be pretty good. I think this is reflected in my my credit money video on Europe. Like, hey, this actually helps people to grow their business and to make stuff, basically, right? But then his theory is like, oh, but starting in the 80s and then going to the 90s and now, there has been this process called financialization, where banks have become much more. It's become much more normal that they now allocate credit to speculative assets or financial assets like mortgages, it used to be stocks a lot, right? And then, maybe not coincidentally, from that moment on, we've seen all of these massive financial bubbles and much more instability than we had before that. So I think that model is definitely still valid, and I'm teaching that model with him in our courses. Do you think credit allocation should be focused more on real economic growth instead of speculative assets? And some greetings from Peru after that. Greetings back from the Netherlands. Yes, I think that credit should be focused more on economic growth rather than speculation. I think that, speculation has really gotten a bit out of control. I know I haven't focused too much on it on the channel as of so far, because I think there was just so much misinformation about central banking and how that all works out there, that I wanted to focus on that first. But that actually landed me in some hot water sometimes in the comment section, because people were saying, so, you're promoting quantitative easing or you're defending banks. And I can understand why they would say that, but I'm not that positive about all of that. I do think that the economy has become too financialized. Just for a personal example, like me moving from the Netherlands to Belgium, and the Netherlands housing market is just absolutely insane. The Belgian one, they will tell you it's insane, but it's from a Dutch perspective or from a UK or Scandinavian or perhaps even American perspective, is not that crazy. So if you move from a country where the housing market is insane to one where it's less insane, you make some money, right? Even though I put it all in a new house, so I don't. But the profit on that was more than what I earned from YouTube in 1.5 years. And I think that's wrong, right? That can't be good for the economy, in the sense that the one thing was me, just owning a house, sitting on my ass doing nothing. And the other thing was working my ass off. And the one thing earns more than... And so I think that's a prime example of financialization, and that is a consequence, likely, for a large part, of credit going way too much to the financial sector rather than, and to asset prices and houses and all of that. Zimbabwe, what can be done to let banks increase productive credit creation when it is low? For example, in Japan, 1991, and USA, 2008. So there, when you say when it's low, I'm assuming that you mean when credit creation is low, and perhaps also the economy. So there, this is why I think central banks at that time drastically lowered interest rates and pumped liquidity into the system to take some of that risk away of starting to lend again. So, but then in highly financialized economies, it's quite tricky to get them to lend productively again. Like, how do you know that they won't start lending to re-inflate that same asset bubble, which is very tricky. But actually, I just came across this press release by the European Central Bank, where they have now, with the corona crisis, started this project where they forced. They had this. They would lend to banks, and in the conditions it would be, but only if you re-lend that money to firms and households. Well, the household thing I think is pretty stupid because that mostly goes into mortgages. But them sort of specifying the firms is an improvement, I guess, and it shows you that you can actually steer that a little bit. Although, I mean, you should be careful, I think, with how much you can steer, because market participants are very clever and often get, find workarounds around your clever policy design. Another question: what do I think about Richard Werner, especially what he says about how banks have to change? So the thing is, I don't know if everybody knows Richard Werner, but he is an economist who got famous by publishing this book called Princes of the Yen. So that's about Japan's central bankers. And so I definitely got a lot of comments on my Japan video. Hey, this looks a lot like what Richard Werner was saying, and do you know Richard Werner? And the thing is that my supervisor at when I did my PhD, and currently also my boss, Professor Dirk Bezemer, he actually worked for Richard Werner at a certain point. And so when I wanted to know how banks create money, because that's what got me into economics, I got sort of recommended to talk to Dirk Bezemer, and he gave me this book by Richard Werner, A New Paradigm in Macroeconomics is what it's called, and it also focuses on Japan for a lot. And so he has definitely inspired my thinking in the beginning. But where Richard Werner and I differ is that he looks at this issue like, oh, banks create money and central bankers have made a lot of mistakes in perhaps ruining the economy in Japan by letting the bubble get out of control. And then I say those same things, I think. But then I go like, oh, but I think the reason for that is that at the time you had this economic orthodoxy where markets are perfect, finance doesn't really matter, a bubble can never really happen because it's not rational to do it. So where I see sort of stupidity, if you can say that, he sees conspiracy. So that's where we differ. He's, I think, very much into conspiracy theories, and I'm more often into stupidity theories. Will you do more debunk videos? Yes, I will. I want to make a series out of that one. I am planning a response video to a video by Wendover Productions about the global North-South divide, because I heard a lot of people complaining about that one, and I typically get the impression that Wendover Productions is quite good. Or at least also when I looked at the video, I noticed a big difference with Economics Explained in the sense that Wendover is much more careful in how they phrase things. Like the Economics Explained debunking videos were just so weird for me to do because he just makes these super confident claims that are, when you live like in Netherlands, or if it was about hyperinflation, which I happen to know a lot about, it's like, dude, why would you say that like that? That's so not true, and it's so easy to show that it's not true. But the Wendover one, I think, is different in that regard because he is much more careful in how he phrases things. But I heard a lot of grumbling about that one, and I think the North-South debate is really about, hey, why are countries in the global South poorer than countries in the global North? And I think it's very often connected to climate, and I guess that people in colder climates work harder or something like that, which I think has been totally debunked by development economists. Let's see how that goes. But I want to make a series out of it. I think it's very important to do that because it's also something that I personally found annoying, that it's very difficult to know which YouTube channels you can trust. They don't post their sources. That's why I'm trying to do that. And also, the flashiest channel is not necessarily the one that actually knows what's going on, and they can still get so much views for, basically not saying the truth. And so I think it's very important to have that in the Econ Tube community, someone who polices or like challenges you if you really mess up. Channels that are also in my crosshair, so to say, are Jack Chappelle, which also has a lot of alarmist videos, and hyperinflation is imminent and all of that sort of stuff. I was also looking at Jake Tran, but he did the same thing as Economics Explained, but Economics Explained was just the bigger video, and so I ended up making the response to that one. But Jake Tran also is a fun channel. He makes great videos, but sometimes when he talks about money, it's just worthy of a response. Let's put it like that. And then I'm also maybe looking at some of the I call them financial conspiracy tube. There are some channels like Epic Economists and Heresy Financial, and I think there are a lot of those types of channels that I think would really be nice or good to someone have a critical look at. I have a lot of plans for that series. I don't want to make it my main one because I'm interested in telling my own stories, but I think it's important for the community. It's fun to do, and a lot of people really seem to enjoy those videos, so I will be making them. Okay, here's another question I get a lot. What do you think of MMT? So MMT is some modern monetary theory, and I think the main point of modern monetary theory is the government can create money, and so it can never run out of money. So that is often interpreted as by people saying, well, but then you're saying the government can borrow infinitely and, whatever, there's no limit. That's not true, as I understand it. This is something that I hear only from people who talk about MMT, but never from people who are MMT researchers themselves. They say, that's how I interpreted it. They say, well, the limit is inflation. So if the government prints a lot, you will get inflation at some point. And so that is what limits government spending. And I think they often attach it to political means or motivations, which is saying, oh, we can actually, especially in Western economists and especially in America, we can actually pay for a lot of the stuff that we're not paying for now. And so because we're so far away from inflation taking hold, I think that's sort of the nuanced position that they take. But the theory itself is much more extensive than what I just said. And I actually don't know too much about it yet. So I think I'll have to do a video on it at some point. Yeah. What are your thoughts on the broader fiat currency devaluation due to printing of money globally and sovereign debt increases? So, I mean, this is a very hot topic on YouTube, right? And especially now, I totally understand why, because we have much more inflation than we used to. And in emerging economies also there's a lot of inflation. But for a European and I think also for Americans or people from the USA, inflation used to be extremely low. And Japan is even more extreme, right? Where you could say that they really did a lot of money printing, even though, they didn't actually do that. They had a lot of QE and a lot of government debt increase, which is similar in effect. But and there they had deflation, right? So I'm wondering, is that link really, really so strong? And it might differ for economies, but I think the narrative, the simple narrative of money printing, inflation, is too simple. And also, I do know that the stance from many economists is that a little bit of inflation is good. They want that. They want 2% inflation. But I have never found the arguments for that to be too convincing myself. But I will do a video on inflation with the channel Unlearning Economics, which is another academic from the UK. A bit more political, I think, than I am typically. But he's definitely someone who knows his stuff. And we'll do a video on inflation and where it comes from in the future, because that's a very difficult topic. What do you think of economies of countries like Sri Lanka that are heavily indebted to China? Very interesting. So I haven't done... I think this is very important for me to tell you, is that whenever I do a video on a country, it takes me, a full week of research, sometimes more. And I learn a lot on that specific country. And Sri Lanka is one I haven't done research on, but I do understand that they have relied quite a bit on Chinese funding over time, or the last couple of years. And I do think that and that goes for the broader Belt and Road Initiative, where a lot of countries in Asia have been funded by Chinese money. But I think what I've seen, they're going about it the wrong way, I think, because so what I read ends up happening a lot of times is that they borrow money from China to develop, which is really good, I guess, right? Like in principle. But then who comes in? A Chinese construction firm to make it all. So that's already like a big loss for the economy, which is important if you want to pay back your debt, right? Like as a country, there's not necessarily something wrong with borrowing from abroad, but you prudently should do that productively so that you can repay those loans later, right? And that doesn't seem to be happening. And it also seems that there is some sort of geopolitical, strategic objectives there of where if they won't be able to repay the loan, they might lose this port or some other strategic object. So the answer to that question is, like, in principle, I think it's totally fine and normal that developing countries start borrowing more from sort of upcoming global economies. But I'm not sure how prudent they are going about making sure that credit ends up productively. So how do you get into agent-based modeling? So I really like this question because this is what my thesis was about. Do I have it? I don't know if you can actually read this, but this is agent-based simulations of monetary policy and financial markets. That's my thesis. And agent-based simulations are a way of modeling the economy that is very much like a computer game. So there's actually this great channel which I really love. It's called Primer. I don't know if you've seen it, but they do simulations and with these weird blue blob people to visualize it. And that's actually agent-based modeling. So it means that you actually have your little computer people do stuff, like traders in my case. And how do you get into that? Well, you have to learn how to program first. So the first 2 years of my PhD were spent learning programming in Python. But there's also this amazing software called NetLogo, which you can use for free, and you can start playing around with some super simple agent-based models. So that's I think the best way to get into that. Asking about cryptocurrencies, I think there's also some other questions about cryptocurrencies. This is a subject that has my interest as well. I want to do a couple of videos about it in the future from an economist perspective, because I think a lot of the crypto YouTube space focuses on either how the technology works or how much money you can make. And I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in, can it be new money, right? I think that's the most interesting bit. And Joshua asks if they have a capped supply, so the supply is stable. And so the idea is that they are deflationary because there's such a limited supply. And so if you have an economy that is expanding, but you have a currency that is stable, then you likely will get deflation in the sense that this currency becomes more valuable while your economy expands and people can't get their hands on it to trade. So I think that idea is not underrated at all, but we haven't fully seen that yet because these cryptocurrencies aren't typically used as money on a large scale yet. That's why sometimes now they are inflationary in the sense that some of the cryptocurrencies do go down. But I don't think they're very promising as money. How would you compare the range of tools available in decentralized finance to centralized ones? I can't yet fully answer that question because I still have to get into DeFi. I want to do a couple of live interviews with some players in that scene, actually, if this stream is a success. Which I think it already is for me. But so I can't comment on it too much yet, but I think that the whole idea is super interesting. But from my agent-based modeling experience, I do question how well people are, because often the idea is in decentralized finance, we just program rules for the financial institutions. And then based on that, people trade through that rather than through a bank, for example. But I like that idea, and I think where it's coming from a programmer mindset. You think, well, these people are super annoying, they're unpredictable, you can't trust them, which you can't always, of course. But what I've noticed when making agent-based models or trying to make my virtual economies is that often the system would do something that I hadn't expected beforehand. And so I'm wondering if you code up a decentralized finance system with fixed rules or machine learning or, I don't know, maybe anything like that, not human, perhaps it doesn't have the flexibility to handle a situation which a programmer hadn't expected beforehand, which will happen, I think, in a complex system. So, but more on that later. Fossil fuel prices are soaring now that the economy recovers from COVID. When do you expect prices to go down, and how disruptive is this price boom? Yeah, crazy how these have soared. So this also ties into this earlier question where the energy market is something I'm not super experienced in yet, but I do want to make a video about it at some point. But I do know that they have this very strong dynamic where supply, it takes a very long time to adjust to demand. And I know that not even a year ago, there was just an oversupply of both oil and gas, right? And sort of the idea was that this would be the new norm. But the thing is, because it takes so long to activate a lot of these shale oil fields and especially if you want to explore new fields, you get these massive swings. In economics, I think the model that best describes this is called the hog cycle model, because this also happens with hogs, which is another word for pigs. But I don't know when it will change. Also because it depends a lot on politics, right? Like just yesterday, apparently Russia announced that they would increase supply. So I think that's the trouble with people making predictions in economics. This is based on humans doing stuff. So I can tell you, like, oh, based on the supply and demand, which I have done research about, it should go down. But then maybe Putin has a geopolitical goal and comes in, and my prediction is gone. Should we fear stagflation? What's your perspective? How will this be impacted by rising energy prices? So stagflation is the idea that you have stagnation and inflation. And why is this weird? Because the main theory of inflation, the one that most economists use, is based on demand. So if overall demand in an economy climbs by a lot, then you might expect an overall increase of prices. This is what they often use in terminology, is they're saying the economy is overheating. So that's why this is very controversial in the sense that inflation, if you believe that about inflation, then you think, oh, you have inflation and an economy that's overheating. So you can't have stagnation and inflation. But as we are experiencing now, a lot of inflation also comes from the supply side, in the sense that your resources might become more scarce, or in many of our cases, supply chains are disrupted, and so we get inflation from that side. And if that happens, I think we can technically definitely get stagflation, because we could very well see stagnation. I mean, our economy is still very, debts are really high, so it's quite vulnerable, I would say. And we could get a lot of supply-driven inflation right now. So I think we could technically get stagflation, but it would be different from the 70s, because in that time period, labor unions were still much stronger than they are today. And so they also had an impact on inflation, in the sense that the economy was down, but they were so strong that they could still negotiate higher wages. And so the dynamic will probably be different. Will you do a China video? Yes. I want to do a couple of videos like my Japan video, which is all about the rise, or like the Japan one was about the fall of a major economy. But I want to do like a rise and fall series that's a bit more in depth. And in that series, the Eurozone will be the first one, because I can use it for one of my courses in November. And then after that, I want to do a China one. But the China economy is just so insanely complicated that I have to do a lot of research on that to make a proper contribution. Could you comment on how window guidance was carried out in China and affected its economy, as you mentioned in the Japan video I did? So window guidance, for people who haven't seen the Japan video, is a policy that's just not very often discussed in the West, which is about the central bank saying to banks, look, you have to increase your credit supply. by this amount, and sometimes even like to this industry, to that industry, and to that. So it's economic planning actually. And the Japanese did it, and the Chinese did it as well. I read a paper about this, and I suspect that it has had a big impact. I think it's easier to do if you're a developing economy, because then it's more difficult for people to get around that. You saying, oh, you should put it there, but then sneakily that sector using it for something else. Or you could maybe see it as, using a shotgun to shoot at a problem or something, where you just have this very wide spread. So it's a very inaccurate tool, which could be great for an economy that's just getting started. But I know that's not an answer to your question. Has it had an impact on China? I think so. And so the idea that I have for the China video at the moment is, unlike the Japan video was subdivided into decade. But for the China one, I would like to focus on some of the stories that economists typically, especially Western economists, typically don't discuss. So, they will always say, oh, well, it was just, communism and then a market economy, and so they now very rich. That's it. But there are a lot of communist countries which also became capitalists, and they didn't become super rich. So I think there's more to the story. And I think one chapter of that story will be window guidance. What are your views on the prospect of central bank issued digital currencies? Thank you. Well, I also want to do a video about that one. It's been on my list for a long time, but I just don't have the time to do everything at once. But what do I think about them? I think it's high time that they come, because it's just, we use a digital currency now. I think the monopoly that private banks have on issuing digital currency is a bit weird. Why do we give this monopoly to these private enterprises? So I think it's good that they would come with those, but I guess there are very legitimate privacy concerns. Like, do we want the government to have all of our transactions? So I hope they come up with a way where it's sort of voluntary, where there are central bank digital currencies, and then there are also private currencies circulating side by side. And then another argument, central bankers, I once asked this same question to the Dutch central bank governor a couple of years ago, and then he said, we're not going to do it because there could be a bank run. But I think that's a pretty dumb argument, in the sense that banks should be able to either provide a better service on your money, right? Like more convenient, better application, or a higher interest rate. And otherwise, they're not doing a very good job at being a bank, right? Is the Phillips curve dead? The idea about the Phillips curve, it ties into what I mentioned earlier about inflation, where you have inflation from the demand side, and that can come, I think, from two sources. One is money printing, often not in the form of money printing, but I do think that if you would create a lot of money in an economy that's not ready for it, that you could get, and that translates then into demand, and that translates then into inflation. But the other one, which was more popular in the last couple of decades among economists, is the Phillips curve, which is more about the economy overheating first, and not money creation first, but the economy overheating, and then laborers or workers collectively asking for higher wages. And so there, if that is true, if that is how the economy works, there should be this relationship between wages on the one hand and inflation, or unemployment on the one hand and wage and inflation on the other one. And that one has been very difficult to find in the data these last couple of years. But I don't think it's dead, in the sense that I think it's just one of the channels of inflation. So, if that channel is very weak at this point, doesn't mean that it has to be very weak in the future. But I would never use only the Phillips curve to understand inflation. Opinion about the Argentinian Peso, which I know is... so, as I understand it, Argentina is a highly dollarized economy. So a lot of people not only use the peso, but they also use the American, the US dollar. And I think that's why they get into these debt troubles very often because they borrow not in their own currency. But as some of you earlier already mentioned, it makes sense to do that because it's much less risky to borrow in dollars from the perspective of many Argentinians. So I think it's a weak currency, and I think they really need a good plan to get it back on its feet. Because if you are a dollarized economy, I think that is a viable strategy sometimes. Like if you really messed up your currency, you could choose to adopt dollars. But you typically want to get rid of that right away because you don't issue dollars. So if your economy gets into trouble, no one will come to help you typically, right? So I think the peso should be improved, if you could say that. But that's very difficult, and I'm not sure how capable the Argentinian government is of actually doing that. But Argentina is also a candidate for my Rise and Fall series of videos because I've heard credible arguments for people saying that the standard story, that it used to be this paradise economy rivaling the US and then sort of falling because they implemented socialism or something. I think that I've heard good arguments that story is not the complete story. So I think I should have a deep dive on that as well at some point. Yeah, as more countries are increasing their interest rate amidst the pandemic, is the economy really recovering? That's a good question. I think the economy is really recovering in quite a few countries, but I'm not sure if that is causing the inflation at the moment. So I do think there's a bit of a risk, and this is also a debate that economists are having right now. And it really ties into what I said about, is inflation coming from the supply side or from the demand side? If it's coming from the demand side, it makes sense to raise interest rates. If it's coming from the supply side, it doesn't necessarily make sense to raise interest rates. But a lot of countries are doing that, like, for example, Russia, I think Brazil as well, if I'm just top of my head. And I'm not sure if that's smart at the moment. But one counter argument to my own argument there is that for these countries, they also have to really take into account that they get enough money flowing in. So raising your interest rate can sometimes also be for them a way of attracting foreign capital. But they always have this dilemma between raising interest rate to get more foreign money, but at the risk of sort of destroying your own economy. So there's this inherent dilemma there, I think. Let me see. What if every country had UBI? What if the entire world? Yeah, that's also a very interesting question. So UBI is another subject that I should do more research on. But that being said, it's very difficult to do more research on that because UBI has never really been tried on a large enough scale, in my opinion. I know they had a lot of trials, but they would do it in a village or something, and then they would look at how does it impact the life of these individuals. And they typically found that they would be less stressed, and they typically also found that they would not necessarily stop looking for work. So, okay, that's great, but I'm more interested in the macroeconomic impact of UBI, or universal basic income, which is, just for everyone who doesn't know about UBI, is giving everyone sort of an income, non-conditional on them working or doing anything back for your state. And there it does remind me of one thing that I discovered when I made these agent-based macroeconomic models. So in these models, we did have a business cycle of sorts. So the economy would sometimes collapse and sometimes it would go back up. But the weird thing is then I would dive into that model with all my little simulated people. And I would wonder, why does it stop? Like, why does it go back up? Not at rock bottom, but at some point. And what I found there is that Social Security sort of put a floor under the economy. And I suspect that UBI might do that as well. But that being said, so that could be very useful. Then again, I do understand the idea or the argument that there are some people who stop working if you only give them money. I don't think it's like a lot of people don't work like that, but some do. So Because we have never tried this, it's very difficult to predict if it will work. But it's a very interesting idea that I want to explore further as well at some point. How can North Korea grow its economy? Keeping Kim. We have a Kim fan in the house. North Korea is also, and that's definitely an economy I don't know that much about, because it's just so, they don't have any credible data, right? How can they grow its economy? It is possible, I think, just like any economy can grow. But for them, I think it would be smart to not antagonize sort of their neighbors as much, or maybe even the US as much, and try to, because once the sanctions are lifted, it could export more, right? That's what I would do if I were them, because it seems a bit useless. And that, like, even if you want to go against the USA, which is fine, they can better do that after they've grown their economy, like China did, right? But anyway, I'm not a political scientist. PJ has a question. If the inflation is supply side, then shouldn't central bankers reduce the money supply? No, because that's also typically something you would do if the inflation is from the demand side, because then you get less activity and the economy cools down. But if it's from the supply side, for example, now, like a lot of our inflation is imported from China because there are major supply disruptions in China. And so a lot of the stuff that we import gets more expensive here. Well, that's inflation, right? And that's actually bad for the economy. So if you then cool down the economy as well, does that change the supply disruptions in China? I don't think so, right? So no, I don't think that will help. You should collaborate with Unlearning Economics. I will do that. We have an inflation video planned, but it's my fault. The idea is that I will send him sort of the main stories of inflation, and that we're going to comment on it together, just like I did with Econoboy in my USA versus Netherlands video. But I'm way behind schedule, and I have a lot of work to do for the universities as well. But it will come, and hopefully very soon. Siegfried asks how to save the Turkish economy. So Turkish economy is very interesting because they have sort of this crisis that's very similar to how many emerging market economies have a crisis where they just import a lot, more than they export. And so their currency got under pressure. And then they have a leader in Mr. Erdogan, who is a very unorthodox economist and believes that high interest rates actually contribute to inflation. And so they often do the reverse of what you would typically do. But actually, I just saw this commentator saying that now the Turkish economy is adjusting somewhat because of how low the lira has been for some time. You know, traditional theory would say, but so then, okay, their exports become more competitive, and so that will help them sort of get out of this situation, which doesn't always work because it takes a very long time to build up an export industry. But I just saw this tweet from an economist that I do respect, where they said that might be happening. So it might save itself somewhat. But I'll have to do a full video on Turkey to give a more intelligent answer. What's in your opinion, the best pension system in the world? So it was really nice for the America versus Netherlands video to dive into pension systems a little bit. I do think it's important that a pension system works for everybody and not just for the most wealthy people in society. So there I would discredit the American system somewhat. So in that sense, the Dutch one is better. But there are also very different pension system designs. And one thing that I thought was interesting is that in the old days, you used to also have pension systems that don't depend on people saving now or like consuming less and putting that all in financial markets, which might inflate the values of these financial markets. But it just being a transfer from the younger generation to the older generation. And that is something I would really like to explore more. So my gut feeling would be a pension system that works like that might be super interesting from a macro perspective. Nicholas with some information on the French pension system. Interesting. Yeah, so he's saying that with the age pyramid reversing, the system gets underfunded in a system like the one I described. Which is obviously true. But that also happens in a system where people save, but perhaps later. Is that correct? I mean, I do know that in the Netherlands at the moment, we also have that problem. Do you think the Rethinking Economics movement has changed the economics curriculum at universities? So I know what you're talking about. The Rethinking Economics is a movement that started, I think, in the UK and US mainly. And it was all about students saying, you know what, all of these sort of neoclassical models where we have these optimizing agents and the economy is always in equilibrium, it's always going to a stable path. That's just not what we see in real life, and we should change the curriculum. I fully supported that movement. I was part of it as a student, or at least sympathetic to it. Has it changed the curriculum? Yes, I think so, actually, because so for example, I made this video right at the start of the channel about how banks actually create money, and there I said the money multiplier is a myth, it doesn't work. And now actually my father is an economics high school teacher, or used to be, and I went to a conference with him, and actually they told me, we actually changed this last year, so that is working. And also more and more I get comments from people under that video saying, well, I didn't have the money multiplier, or what you said in that video is exactly what my economics professor is saying. So I think that is working to a certain extent, but not by enough, in my opinion. What do you consider to be the last big breakthrough to the field of economics? That's a very interesting question, because that's because the thing is, like with physics or chemistry or something, breakthroughs are far more obvious. Like someone invents something and it works all the time. Whereas with economics, we influence the system that we study, and so sometimes, like for example, when there was Nobel Prize winners Black and Scholes, and in finance, and they invented, or they formalized this way of pricing derivatives or options. And so that was hugely successful in the sense that, like, you really saw that a lot of traders were sort of taking that and putting it into practice. So it worked, but then their own hedge fund, using that, went bust in a spectacular way in '97. Don't quote me on that, but and so what had happened is that they had not taken into account that the market changed, using that instrument. So that seemed like a big breakthrough, and it was obviously very influential. But so do you catch my drift? Like, that's partially what makes economics less prone to having breakthroughs. And a second thing is that, especially in macroeconomics, the data is just so horribly bad that it's also very difficult to verify certain theories. And also the system, because it's complex, might actually change. So this is something that I ran into when making these macroeconomic agent-based models, is that in those economies, so this was a pretty big computer program with 10,000 agents, and there were households, firms, banks, central bank, and they were all interacting. And I had programmed them, myself. So I knew what everybody was doing. And still, it was sometimes really difficult for me, the God who created that little universe, to understand what was going on with it because of complexity, meaning that the system is so complex that one thing reacts to another. And even though I knew how they individually reacted, I didn't know how they would interact after a while. Does that make sense? So that's another thing, I think, why, especially in macroeconomics, it's very difficult to get breakthroughs, because it's just very difficult to check if a theory actually works. Ooh, this is also an interesting question from Darius Koenig. I think German probably. Hi, Yuri. Can the very high target 2 balance of, for example, Germany, in your opinion, hurt the country or its inhabitants? Could you maybe plan a video on this in the future if it's too complex now? Yeah, so target 2 is something, I just probably have to explain to people who aren't in Europe, and even if you are, is a balancing system that the European Central Bank uses to balance between country central banks. So, because you have these big trade differences between, like, for example, Greece and Germany, you also have money flowing the other way. But in how that the ECB sort of handles that is by saying, well, let's delay the money flow, and then you have this target 2 balance, which is positive for Germany and negative for Greece. So that's how they handle that. So it's and because the imbalances in the Eurozone are pretty big and very consistent, meaning that they remain very big, like Germany and Netherlands are massive exporters, and they have remained like that for a long time, whereas like theory would predict that shouldn't be allowed to happen because, you know, then they get more expensive, less competitive, and so then at some point, you know, the reverse happens. Although we have, of course, a fixed exchange rate in Europe, so that might play a part in that. But I don't think I know the target 2 balances themselves are a big issue in Germany politically. So they say, well, we're sneakily lending out money to the Greek people again, right? But I don't think that's an issue because, you know, we have a shared monetary system. This probably also happens in the USA, where some states' central banks are in deficit while some other state, like New York or something, central banks have a surplus, and that's totally fine. But so that wouldn't necessarily be a problem. But these consistent imbalances in the Eurozone, I think, are definitely a problem. The same way as it would always be. If you always export more than you import, at some point, you know, your customers are going to run out of money to pay you. So that's a problem, but I don't think the target 2 balances are in themselves a problem. They're more a reflection of that problem. Will I plan a video on it? Yeah, maybe I will. Maybe I should put it in the Eurozone video. It seems to be a big part of that. Any economics video games you would suggest? Yes. Economics? No. Well, video game about economics? I don't... So I personally really like to play City Skylines. I think that's a really fun game partially for the economic aspect of it. But having made these simulation models, I know that a lot of these economies cheat in the sense that they have sort of a black hole or something, or where the money supply always increases, or they maybe don't even have money at all, and so some agents just can run infinitely negative balances. That's how that works, and that's very frustrating for me as an economist, because I know they're sort of cheating, and so their economies are super unrealistic, and that's why I don't like. That just irks me a little bit, and so I stick to playing shooters and RPGs more. But City Skylines is a very interesting game nonetheless, I think, from an economics perspective. And at some point, I would actually like to try if I can get some agent-based modelers to turn some of their simulations into a game. I think that would be really fun, because there just aren't that many real economics simulation games, right? Is it possible to think of an economic theory without the rational agent assumption? Yes, that's very much possible. I made one such model at some point where traders in the financial markets, like half of them would be mean reversion trader and half would be speculative, so thinking, oh, if the price goes up, it will continue to do so. And that did work. But it is very hard to actually make that work. And also, I really criticize the rational agent for how excessive it's implemented. But to be honest, I think if you look at a lot of markets, many people do act rationally individually, in the sense that they try to think critically about how to succeed in this market, but they just can't. They're not insanely rational, right? Like they're not super irrational most of the time. Like people in markets are not typically like, go to an auction of, I don't know, fish or something. Like the people are not in a very emotional state all the time. They are rational often. It's just that they're not hyper rational and they can't look into the future. And if you're being rational at the individual level, doesn't mean that that as a collective people are rational. Like for example, in a housing market or something, it's perfectly rational to think that the price will go up tomorrow. But it's not rational that everybody thinks that the price will always go up. Okay. So it is possible to have an economic theory without rational agent assumption, but I think it's very difficult because people are, in many cases, are fairly rational, I would say. Here, Neocesir says, bounded rationality and informational frictions, etc. can be an alternative to perfect rationality. And yes, I totally agree with that. So in all of my models, I always use a bounded rationality framework, which is basically a fancy way of saying what I said. Like people are not super irrational typically, but they can't see into the future. So they're boundedly rational. Actually, if you make an agent-based model, you can't make a perfectly rational model. It's just an agent that looks into the future, because then you would have to program a computer agent that knows what the simulation is going to do, even though I, as a modeler, don't even know what the simulation is going to do. So I found that to be impossible, which I thought was interesting. But these other types of modelers, they make different types of models, and that's why that works really well, actually, like a fully rational agent. I'm curious of the flow of wealth and how unaccounted for assets contribute to valuations in markets. For example, the Pandora Papers. Yeah, that is like by blank. Thank you for that question. That's actually a very interesting question in the sense that I've been thinking a little bit about how particularly London and or the UK and the US, I guess Europe as well. No, I think like if you take London, New York, and their role of their financial system is massive, and so a lot of wealth is flowing from emerging market economies through some corrupt elites to those places. But it's very interesting, like how does that affect, for example, property prices in London? I think, if you go into the Pandora Papers, you'll find a lot of people from, leaders from foreign countries or having property in London. Well, has that affected property price in London, thereby making it difficult for teachers and let's say firemen and police women to live in London? Yeah, probably, right? But we're not talking about that too much. So this is also something I would be interested in. Is the recent increase in real estate stock prices related to central bank money printing? No. Well, I don't think it's related to central bank money printing in the traditional sense, but quantitative easing likely had a big impact on asset price increases, I think, but it's not everything. Like, for example, and I'll just take the example I mentioned at the start of the stream, I'm moving from Netherlands to Belgium. Property prices in Belgium are far less crazy than in the Netherlands, but we have the same quantitative easing program, right? So I don't think it's everything. It can't explain everything, I think, but it probably has been a factor, and I think this is something where central bankers should really look at their policy and say to themselves, okay, we did this to create inflation, and it's not really creating too much, or it didn't used to create too much inflation at least. Now we do have inflation, perhaps, and we know that it's likely driving up asset prices, making not only increasing inequality, but also increasing inequality in a way that is not fair, right? Like people just lucky, had assets, QE increases prices of these assets, that's not fair, right? Like they did nothing to get that money. So I think QE does have an impact, and I think central bankers should really be critical about if this is what they want. What future, by Amar L, what future heterodox economic theories are you interested in, such as behavioral economics? This is so heterodox economics for people who aren't, part of this world. So you have orthodox economics, which is mainstream economics, and then there are a lot of people from different schools of thought who call themselves heterodox economists. But then, if you go into that world, there are a lot of schools of economic thought. One of that is behavioral economics. I have featured that on the channel, basically meaning like, people, especially in financial markets, aren't always rational, but also there are certain specific biases, which is interesting, I think. But the biases, I just read a blog, I think, or maybe even an article, I don't know, recently, that a lot of the studies by famous behavioral economists about these specific biases, like loss aversion and other biases, didn't hold up that well. They weren't easy to replicate, which I thought was very interesting. I'm not sure if that's true, but I do like behavioral finance a lot. The biases thing, I thought was super interesting when I read about it at first, but I'm not sure if that's a major part of the macroeconomy that I'm interested in. But I am actually more, influenced by a school of thought which is called complexity economics. I wrote a blog about it on Exploring Economics website. If you Google Exploring Economics, Complexity Economics, you'll find that. And that is much more about seeing the economy as a complex system, which is not necessarily always in an equilibrium. So it could be in a stable state, but it's sort of always moving and it's always doing interesting things, whereas sort of the standard economic models are more about this stable equilibrium. And I think there's still a future in that school, which I think is very interesting. I also used to talk to a lot of people from post-Keynesian economics, but I don't know too much about what is post-Keynesian and what is not. But I think complexity economics definitely still has a future. Okay, Olaf asking for my take on the Austrian School of Economics. Austrian School of Economics, there are two parts of it. There's the monetary school, which is, for me, too often comes across, at least, I'm not an expert, but on Austrian economics, comes across as gold, only coin, fixed currency, expanding economy. I don't think that's a very smart idea. But they make really good points about banks creating money and pointing towards the danger of that. I think they go too far. They say, that's all bad. No, but it is a risk, and it does create bubbles, and that's what the Austrians often mention, and I totally agree with them on that one. And also, and this I think is less well known, the Austrian economists are very big on economic complexity. Like, for example, Hayek has also written extensively on economic complexity, and specifically that, and sort of this sometimes inspired their more right-wing stances, that you can't control everything as a government. And you might have noticed that I think that the government can do a lot of good, but I do take their point that in an economy there are lots of individual decision makers, and that central planning, for that reason, is like the system is just too complex for that. That's one of the key points of Austrian economics. It's less widely known, and I totally agree with that one. Come see. This is the macro cat has adopted the color scheme as well. Thanks for doing what you do. Your channel stands out in a sea of trading grifters and hyper-politicized commentators. Oof, yeah. Not saying politics, economics isn't intertwined. No, I totally agree with that. I mean, I do voice my, saying I don't think central bankers should continue QE at the moment because of rising inequality, which is inherently a political statement, right? But what I try to keep in mind when doing that is that I think that the economy should work for people who work for the economy, in a sense that, like, if people produce goods and services and teach and I don't know, they should be rewarded for that, and they can also, get rich from that. But people shouldn't be rewarded for not contributing to society wherever possible. And I think that's I don't think that's a very controversial ideology. But I do think it's important for you all to know that this is something, that's how I think about things. So like if people comment sometimes, oh, you're biased, that's obviously true, right? Like I have my biases as well, but this is what they are. So that maybe helps when trying to judge my videos. If I have thoughts on Saudi Arabia attempting to diversify its economy, yes. My thought about that is, haven't they been trying to attempt to diversify their economy for like 20, 25 years now? I'm not sure how well that is going. The last time I checked, they had all of these new city sort of plans, new city in the desert and city of the future, which I'm conflicted about because I love those in the sense that I just love the ambition of it. And as an economist, I hope it works, but they typically don't work. And they're typically sort of the product of rulers that are very ambitious, but don't really make the effort of really, digging down to the individual level of how an economy works and putting in the hard work to make it work, right? Like, so I'm not super optimistic about how successful it is. And someone also asked me, could you recommend some literature to get started with monetary economics? I'm very interested in the topic and I'll end my bachelor this year. But I haven't found any specialized master courses. Well, yes. Actually, I just found the perfect excuse to show some of the books that I used for the videos. So this is really an amazing book in my opinion. Money Changes Everything. A lot of my videos, like the one on Athens and also credit money in Europe. And I'm now working on a history of central banking video, which is also for which I also read this book. But that being said, I think a lot of the more formal monetary economics textbooks are really boring and outdated. Just to throw in some controversial statement. And Frank says, can you do a book list for people like us that want to learn more about economics? Whenever I try to find stuff, it's usually about free markets, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Yes, I do have a book list now under some of my videos posted, but I have a couple of my books here. I showed one at the beginning of the stream, but I know that there's already one more than 1 hour ago. This is an amazing book. It's really about history, which I love. How Money Changes Everything by William Goochman. I really love that one. This one I love. By Dani Rodrik, very famous development economist. Economics Rules. And this one is, like Dani Rodrik is fairly mainstream, but he's critical about economic models in this book, and he sort of articulates like why he's critical about them. And it's very similar to, I think, what I've said. Like, okay, so like these models have their advantages, because if you make an economic model, it's very clear what your assumptions are. But they're often rubbish assumptions, and the math sometimes makes it very difficult for people to check those assumptions. But this is a book that is also well written and really fun. This is a big inspiration for the channel. Book The Narrow Corridor by Darren Acemoglu, also one of the most famous economists at the moment, and James Robinson. And this is about, like, the narrow corridor is about how there is this narrow corridor between how powerful a state gets and how powerful society gets to keep that state back. And I thought that was, and sort of their main point is like having a more powerful state can be really good for an economy, in the sense that, for example, the Dutch state is very powerful in a way because it can organize these massive events fairly well, and it can organize a military, and it can make super good roads. So it has a lot of power. But the Dutch society and many North Europeans, or like European societies, but they also, like, the societies also have a lot of power. So they sort of constrain that government. Like if you have a corruption scandal. So this was really eye-opening for me living in South Africa for a bit, where there were a lot of corruption scandals. My point. Oh yeah. But the problem was that the politicians just got away with it. And here, like local politicians sort of got... They often get into trouble for like these very minor but still wrong transgressions. Like, I don't know, like not like it's like 500 euros or something to a family man, like a contract to a family member for making a gym or something, which is great. And that shows that society sort of keeps the state in check, but it's still very powerful. Whereas, for example, the South African state, I really noticed that they seem very powerful in the sense that they are very bureaucratic and therefore they are very annoying to deal with. But like if you look at the services that they actually provide or the security that they can actually provide, which is a big deal in South Africa, is very low. And so this theory sort of like the theory in this book deals with that in a very like can explain that, which I think is I had never read before. So those are 3 books. I also have a final one for now. This one I also really liked, Adaptive Markets, because it has much more of a focus on like markets as not being super efficient, but changing all the time and still being somewhat efficient and still having a lot of very smart people in them, by Andrew Lowe. Oh, Nicholas also says that Donut Economics is a good book. I haven't read that one yet, but I've heard great stories about it. And thank you, Salokin, for the donation. I'd add also Good Economics for Hard Times, Tyranny of the Expert, Democracy and Prosperity. The third pillar I do have. I just read it. Thank you for mentioning it. That one is also excellent, really good. It's actually very similar to the Narrow Corridor one I mentioned, where they in the third pillar it's by an Indian economist, mentioning also sort of the role of the community or society, which is very often not thought about. It's very often like the state versus the market. And then the third pillar is about the third pillar, which is community, which is also important. I think it's also something you see in your daily life often, like sports clubs or other events that are not for profit, but they actually play a massive role in the economy, which the economists just don't talk about that much. So it's very interesting. Okay. Because I do also have Piketty here. Can you see it in the background? Yeah, Capital. Yeah, I think so. But the Piketty book, oh my goodness. I remember when he was very popular, I was at a conference in Paris where he was supposed to speak, and I missed him because I ate some very bad food the night before. But he was so popular at the time, and it's great what he did for contributing to the debate on actually talking about inequality. But the book, I just can't get through it. It's not very well written in my opinion. So Xela63, what do you think about games with a very real life like economy, like EVE Online, which offer all the data from where something comes from and so on? What do you think can be learned from them? Yeah, so that's very interesting. Huh? I think there are some videos from YouTubers about these economies, right? Like I've never played EVE Online. It seems like an interesting economy, and I would directly also wonder, like, hey, are they cheating in a way, or perhaps it's not possible because you have all these actual players. So I need to find out more about them. But I do take your point in saying that we can likely learn a lot from these video game economies because all the data is collected, and that's very different from our current economy, right? And I know I mentioned that even in my computer model, I couldn't fully understand what was going on because of complexity. But having all the data means that you can learn a lot more than not having the data, which is often the case in the macroeconomy. Matthias, that's an interesting question. What are your biggest worries, economically speaking, in the world? One of my biggest worries is the debt buildup that we're seeing. So I'm not in the camp of sort of the Austrians on YouTube or like the more populist YouTube economics channel that I think it will sort of explode and like, oh, this whole house of cards will come down. But I do recognize that it might. And and also that, but I think it's more likely that there will be big stagnation at some point, because like if you get a lot of debt build up amongst households, and that is backed up by sort of rising asset prices, and then if these stop rising, you can get massive sort of stagnation, in the sense that is what powers people to go ahead. And maybe it's fine that an economy stagnates at some point, or like sort of reaches its potential. But if that happens in an economy that was super reliant on asset price increases and that being used to pay off debts, that might be a problem. And also the inequality that comes from that. Like I really enjoyed reading the comments under the Dutch video about, inequality is not as bad in the Netherlands as this report made it out to be. But then a lot of people said, yeah, but inequality doesn't matter because as long as like people are not dirt poor. And I get that argument. That's fair enough from the perspective. Like I might not fully agree with it, but it's fair enough. I think it has a point. But from a macroeconomic perspective, that's not true. We do care about inequality because people who are less rich typically spend more of their money, and an economy measures spending, right? Like, so if people hoard wealth, or it's all in the hands of some people who don't spend too much of it, then you can definitely get stagnation, I think. So I'm very worried about this type of stagnation, and also I am very worried about climate change and the effects of that. Living well under the sea level here, but also because I don't know too much about that. So this is something that I would like to know more about. I'm not an expert on climate change at all, so I don't know how worried we should actually be. Perhaps some of you will know, but that makes me more worried. Like if I don't know too much about something, then and a lot of people are saying it's a massive risk, then that does get me worried as well. Like also if you think about like some of the emerging market economies turning into deserts, for example, and what that will do with displacing many people, that will be super chaotic, and that does worry me. Matthäus, is Greece still in a debtor's prison, and if yes, how could it get out? I don't know, to be honest. I think what happened to Greece is a real tragedy. But so you have this thing where if you completely break down an economy, it could be that at some point sort of the bottom point has been reached. But that bottom point is very likely to be much lower for Greece than what it would otherwise have been, because I know that a lot of Greek, like the smartest people from, or not all, but a lot of very smart Greek people have just moved to other parts of Europe. So I wonder if it could ever bounce back fully if we hadn't, let it get out of hand like that. But is it still in a debtor's prison? I don't know. Maybe it's reached bottom, but I should do more research on Greece specifically to tell you. Any fintech on your radar, and why? So yeah, I'm actually looking into stablecoin fintechs at the moment. So I have an interview scheduled with via live stream like this with a fintech called Reserve, who want to make crypto like a reserve currency for emerging market economies, like a stablecoin, which I thought was very interesting. I'm skeptical, but it is on my radar. And another one was recommended to me by the top donor of this stream, Joshua, Liquidity, which is also a stablecoin. So I'm very interested in stablecoins right now because it's just it's such a bold experiment, and I am skeptical. But other than that, fintechs, I really liked the challenger banks at some point, like Revolut, especially in the UK and Europe, and N26 and Monzo. Monzo is also one in the UK, I think. But they seem to have stagnated a little bit now. But those are the main ones at the moment. How do I see South Africa in 20 years? So South Africa, I think, is really at a turning point, in the sense that, I think they had this economy under President Jacob Zuma, where corruption was just running rampant, and the government, was just really messing up. And you see that now with their main power supplier, which still has a lot of blackouts. And that's horrible for people who also want to make the economy grow. Like even myself, when I started the channel, I had some blackouts like every day. At least it was scheduled. But you can imagine that you can't do a live stream if you have blackouts, right? So it can really be horrible for your business. So it's very, very risky, I think, for South Africa as well. But they might turn the corner at some point, because I do think that the Ramaphosa government, while having many faults still, and still many of the same people who are there, at least tried. And so the same way as it took like a couple of years under Zuma, and then the problems started sort of showing up. I mean, of course there were always problems before, but like the main problems started showing up later. This is often the case, I think, with macroeconomics. That's why it's so difficult to judge a president or on the situation now, or because, like this takes a long time. So hopefully South Africa can turn the corner. It has all the ingredients, right? It has a beautiful country, also very productive, fertile lands, and very smart people, and a lot of knowledge still there, and an industrial base for African continent that is still very impressive, right? They have all the ingredients. They do also have a judicial system that stepped in right at the right time and is prosecuting corruption, even though it's not getting everything. So I do think they have. I haven't given up on them entirely, but they do need to turn a corner rather quickly, because people are leaving the country, and the government is still often screwing up. I think. I get a lot of comments on the inequality video. People say, who cares about inequality as long as there are no poor people, or people aren't super poor, who cares? And I understand that point, but actually from a macroeconomic perspective, that's not true, because because the macroeconomy is sort of a circular flow, so people need to spend. That's what we measure in GDP. But if a couple of people own everything and the rest doesn't, then that spending will stop at some point, since all wealth has sort of been hoarded in one place, and then you can actually get that economic growth will slow a lot, or even decline, because some people have just hoarded everything. Philosophical question on wealth inequality. I have no doubt we will be able to improve the world average quality of life and get people out of extreme poverty, mainly through innovation. That's very optimistic of you. But do you think it's theoretically possible to make the whole world as wealthy as Northwestern Europe currently is? I have the feeling much of our purchasing power depends on inequality for cheap labor. Yeah, I've heard people make that argument quite a bit. I'm not sure, to be honest. I think we are able to mobilize our resources. There is enough food, right, for everyone. There is enough space for everyone. There's enough energy for everyone. And for me, macroeconomics is really also about sort of mobilizing resources. And, if we have the resources, then it should theoretically be possible to mobilize these. But does it depend on cheap labor a lot? Maybe, but probably less and less as automation is, underway. Or it could be that some aspects of our life might get more expensive. But at the same time, if people earn more, so this is also something where for the individual, yes, it makes sense that if you have people with low wages, that's great for them, producing, like if you're a producer, making them able to produce more cheap stuff. But for the economy, like your low wage laborer is also a very poor customer, right? So if you start paying people more, in theory, you also create wealthier customers, like if you look at the bigger picture. So I'm wondering how that will interact. So that's why I think it should be theoretically possible, but also for this one, it would help if I would do research on this specific topic a bit more and make a video about it perhaps at some point. Then I would be a bit more confident, but my initial impression is it should be possible. And with that one, I think I will now get that alcohol-free beer and give the cat some attention, because he actually really wants to play now. So thank you all so much for joining, and I will get back to my videos. It's been a bit busy on my side, but I'm in this for the long term, and I will just keep pumping them out. Specifically there will be more response videos, country videos, central banking, inflation videos, and hopefully also some more live streams, because I really enjoyed this, and I will try to interview some people, and I just want to have a way of making more content more quickly. So thanks so much, take care, and I hopefully will see you in the future.